Hey, it's Mark here, and welcome to the next edition of the Employee Survival Guide, where I tell you, as always, what your employer does definitely not want you to know about, and a lot more.
All right, so you've really buried us in paperwork this time. It's like a whole stack of legal briefs and documents all about the FTC's attempt to ban non-competes.
Yeah.
It looks like we've got briefs from the FTC themselves, obviously pushback from the Chamber of Commerce, and even a statement from a company called Ryan LLC, who seems to be right in the middle of it all.
Yes.
So are you ready to dive into this one?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a really interesting time to be looking at this issue. This is not just some kind of legal technicality here. The FTC is really aiming to fundamentally change the rules of the game for an estimated 30 million workers.
Wow.
Across all sorts of industries.
Yeah, that is a huge number of people.
It is.
So maybe just to get our listeners up to speed, could you quickly explain exactly what the FTC is trying to do with this non-compete rule?
Sure. So essentially, they're trying to make it illegal for companies to use non-compete agreements in almost any situation. So, those clauses that you see in contracts that say, if you leave this job, you can't go work for a competitor for, 6 months or a year, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Poof, gone.
Wow.
At least that's the FTC's goal.
That's pretty sweeping.
It is.
No wonder everybody's lawyering up.
Yeah.
So let's start with the FTC side of things. What's the main thrust of their argument here?
Well, they're really coming out swinging. They're arguing that non-competes are inherently unfair methods of competition, which are illegal under the FTC Act. And they're not just going after, specific companies that are using them in a bad way or whatever. They're really saying that the very existence of these agreements is harmful to workers and stifles the entire economy.
Okay, but how are they backing that up? Do they have any specific examples of this, Han?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, in their brief, they talk about the case of the software engineer who was bound by a non-compete after leaving his job. And he had, this great idea for a new app, but he couldn't develop it for 2 years because of the agreement.
Wow.
FTC argues that this kind of situation is preventing innovation across all sorts of different industries.
So it's not even just about, protecting workers from some kind of, unfair contract. They're really saying that these agreements are holding back, progress in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And they also claim that non-competes suppress wages.
Go on.
By limiting workers' options, makes it harder for them to negotiate for better pay and benefits if they can't, easily go work for a competitor.
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
And they also argue that these agreements discourage companies from investing in training for their employees.
Okay, how so?
Well, because they're afraid that the employees will just, take those skills and go to a competitor.
Yeah, right.
So it's kind of a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, it sounds like they're kind of painting this picture of a ripple effect where, these agreements are impacting everything from individual salaries to the competitiveness of whole industries.
That's their core argument, yeah. And they're really bringing a mountain of evidence to support it. They've got economic studies, they've got public comments from workers and businesses and, their own internal analyses.
Oh, wow.
They're really trying to demonstrate that this is a, carefully considered conclusion and not just some kind of knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, but obviously not everyone is buying it. The Chamber of Commerce, for one, is pushing back pretty hard.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Their brief comes out with guns blazing.
Okay.
They basically say that the FTC is massively overstepping its authority.
Wow, okay.
They argue that the FTC Act doesn't actually give the agency the power to issue a blanket ban on a business practice that's been around for so long.
So it's kind of a power struggle then, they're saying that the FTC is trying to act like Congress, making new laws instead of just enforcing the existing ones.
That's really the heart of their argument. Yeah.
Right.
They're calling this a classic major questions doctrine case.
Okay.
And this doctrine basically says that, when an agency is trying to regulate something that has huge economic and political implications, they need clear direction from Congress to do so.
Okay.
And the chamber is arguing that Congress never gave the FTC this kind of power over non-competes.
So their argument really hinges on the scope of the FTC's authority and whether they're exceeding it with this rule.
Right.
Okay, well, what about Ryan LLC? I mean, they're coming at this from kind of a more practical, business-oriented perspective, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. They're a tax consulting firm, and their brief basically argues that banning non-competes would be like a direct threat to their business.
Oh, wow.
They say that they rely on these agreements to protect their trade secrets and client relationships, which they've built up over many years.
So for them, it's really about the potential for like immediate harm. Like they're imagining, employees walking out the door and taking clients with them to a competitor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they argue that without non-competes, they'd constantly be vulnerable to poaching, and they wouldn't be able to invest as much in specialized training for their employees.
Yeah.
Because, what's the point if they're just going to leave?
Right.
So they're basically saying that this rule would throw their whole industry into chaos.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they're highlighting that tension, between protecting businesses on the one hand and then kind of fostering a competitive market that benefits everyone on the other hand.
Yeah, it's a key philosophical question at the heart of this whole debate, and it absolutely gets even more complicated when you start to look at those constitutional concerns that the Chamber of Commerce is raising.
Yeah, they're not just saying the FTC is, overreaching. They're actually kind of questioning the whole structure of the agency,
right? And
whether it even allows for this kind of power.
Exactly, and with limited presidential oversight, is that even constitutional?
Yeah. So hold on, we're talking about like a potential constitutional crisis over non-compete agreements here. I mean, that seems like a pretty big leap.
Well, it might seem like a stretch at first, but it really does get to the core of how our government is designed.
Yeah.
The opposition is basically arguing that the FPC is acting like a mini Congress. They're unilaterally making major economic policy without any of the checks and balances that the Constitution requires. And they're saying that, this kind of power grab upsets the separation of powers, and it could have implications far beyond just, this one rule about non-competes.
That's a pretty heady argument, but it sounds like the FTC is, prepared to defend their position. I mean, they obviously think they're on solid legal ground.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. And a lot of it hinges on their interpretation of the word prevent in the FTC Act. They're basically saying that prevent gives them broad authority to regulate entire industries proactively. They don't have to wait for someone to break the law. They can step in and prevent the harm from happening in the first place.
So it all comes down to like one word. It's amazing how these like tiny details can become like these huge battlegrounds in legal cases.
Absolutely. It's like they're trying to decipher some kind of secret code,
right,
where each side is trying to unlock the, the true meaning hidden within the language of the law.
Yeah.
And actually, speaking of code, another interesting point the Chamber of Commerce brings up is that Congress specifically granted the FTC rulemaking power for unfair or deceptive practices.
Okay.
But they were totally silent on unfair methods of competition.
So they're saying, like, if Congress wanted the FTC to have this power, they would have written it down explicitly.
Exactly. It's a classic argument, statutory interpretation. The opposition is basically saying that, Congress knew what it was doing, and they chose to give the FTC, limited authority in this particular area.
So we've got this back and forth over, the FTC's authority and how to interpret the law. But what about the evidence itself? I mean, is the FTC actually proving that non-competes are always harmful?
Well, that's another major point of contention. The FTC cites all these studies showing that non-competes suppress wages and stifle innovation. But the opposition points out that a lot of those studies are really focused on specific states.
Right.
Not necessarily the nationwide impact that a ban would have.
So are they saying that the FTC's evidence is kind of like not representative enough to justify such a, sweeping rule? It's like trying to predict the weather for the whole country based on like a couple of weather stations?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. The Chamber of Commerce is arguing that, the FTC is overgeneralizing from limited data and that a nationwide ban could have all these unintended consequences that those state-level studies just don't capture.
Yeah. Okay, well, what about the potential costs of this rule? I mean, we've heard Ryan LLC's concerns about losing trade secrets and clients, but does the Chamber make any broader economic arguments?
Oh, yeah. They claim that the FTC's cost-benefit analysis is, like, totally incomplete.
Okay.
And ignores, all these significant downsides. For one thing, they argue that banning non-competes could actually discourage companies from investing in training for their employees.
Oh, interesting.
Because there's no guarantee that those employees will actually stick around to use those skills,
So instead of protecting workers, it could kind of backfire and make them like less desirable hires.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird twist, right?
Yeah.
And they also raise concerns about, increased litigation, even if it's a different kind of litigation than we have now.
Yeah.
They argue that without, these clear non-compete agreements, companies might be more likely to sue each other over trade secret theft or unfair competition,
Yeah.
So you could end up with even more legal battles and uncertainty.
It sounds like they're saying the FTC is trying to solve one problem,
right?
But they might be creating a whole bunch of new ones in the process.
Right. And, they argue that all of these costs could ultimately trickle down to consumers in the form of higher prices.
Oh, okay.
Their argument is that when businesses face more uncertainty and more risk, those costs often get passed along.
So the Chamber of Commerce is painting this picture of all these unintended consequences, less investment, more lawsuits, and potentially higher prices for consumers.
Right.
It's a pretty stark contrast to the FTC's vision of, a more competitive and dynamic economy.
Yeah.
But, this whole debate has really got me thinking about my own experiences.
Oh, yeah. What comes to mind?
Well, I've signed a few non-competes in my time, and honestly, I always felt kind of trapped by them.
Yeah.
It's like, even if you're unhappy in a job, the thought of being like legally barred from working in your field for, a year or more, that's pretty daunting.
Right.
It definitely makes you think twice about leaving, even if it's the right move for you.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That psychological impact of non-competes is something that the FTC really emphasizes in their brief.
Okay.
They argue that these agreements create this chilling effect on worker mobility.
Yeah.
It discourages people from even like exploring new opportunities.
And that makes sense, right? Like if you're constantly worried about like legal repercussions, you're less likely to, take risks or start your own business or even just negotiate for better pay at a different company.
Exactly. The FTC argues that this fear factor ultimately hurts innovation and economic growth.
Yeah.
They want to empower workers to pursue their best interests without being shackled by, these overly restrictive contracts.
But on the flip side, I can also kind of see the argument for businesses wanting to protect their investments.
Yeah.
Like if a company spends a lot of time and money, training an employee, it seems kind of fair that they'd want some assurance that those skills won't immediately be used against them by a competitor.
Yeah, that's really the heart of the debate, finding that right balance between protecting businesses and, fostering a competitive market that benefits everyone.
Right.
And that's where, this case could have ripple effects far beyond non-competes. It's setting a precedent for how much power agencies like the FTC have to really reshape entire industries.
So even if you're, not directly affected by non-competes,
right,
this case could impact, how other regulations are crafted and enforced in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, the outcome of this case could either, embolden agencies to take a more assertive role, or it could force them to kind of, rein in their ambitions and defer more to Congress.
Right.
It all depends on how the courts ultimately interpret the FTC's authority in this case.
So where do things stand now? Like, is there any indication of which way this legal battle might swing?
Well, it's already been kind of a roller coaster ride, A district court actually sided with the Chamber of Commerce and issued a nationwide injunction against the rule. So basically putting it on hold for now.
So round one goes to the opposition.
For now, yeah. But the FTC is appealing that decision. So, this fight is far from over.
Oh, wow.
It could easily end up before the Supreme Court,
No.
which would obviously have massive implications for the balance of power between agencies and Congress.
Yeah, a potential Supreme Court showdown. I mean, that definitely raises the stakes. It sounds like this is a case worth watching closely no matter what industry you're in.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really revealed not just a legal battle over non-competes, but a deeper struggle over the very nature of regulatory power in America. Mm-hmm. This case could have a lasting impact on how agencies operate and how businesses function, for years to come.
So what's the main takeaway for our listener who's been wading through all these, legal briefs with us? What's the so what for them?
I think the key takeaway is that, even these seemingly technical legal disputes can have really profound consequences for everyone. This case is a reminder to pay attention to the regulations that are being debated out there.
Right.
And the potential impact that could have on your work, your industry, even the broader economy.
It's also a reminder that, there are often valid arguments on both sides of these, really complex issues. It's not always a clear-cut case of, good versus bad.
Right.
And it's important to try to understand the nuances and the trade-offs involved.
Exactly. And as this story, continues to unfold, I really encourage our listener to, think critically about the arguments, the evidence, the implications for themselves and the world around them.
Yeah, don't just accept what you hear at face value. Do your own research.
Yeah.
Consider different perspectives and, stay informed about those potential ripple effects. That's what makes being, quote unquote, well-informed so rewarding. It really empowers you to make your own judgments and kind of navigate a complex world.
And who knows, maybe one day you'll be sending us some source material for a deep dive.
Yeah.
We're always up for a challenge.
All right. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
If you like the Employee Survival Guide, I'd really encourage you to leave a review. We try really hard to produce information to you that's informative, that's timely, that you can actually use and solve problems on your own and at your employment. So if you like to leave a review anywhere you listen to our podcast, please do so. And leave 5 stars, because anything less than 5 is really not as good, right? I'll keep it up. I'll keep the standards up. I'll keep the information flowing at you. If you'd like to send me an email and ask me a question, I'll actually review it and post it on there. You can send it to mcarey@capclaw.com. That's capclaw.com.